They call me fearless. It's a word I hear a lot. It's in the introductions at award ceremonies, in the reviews of my documentaries, in the hushed, respectful whispers of the interns at my production company. Anya Sharma. They say, she's completely fearless. She'll go after anyone to get to the truth. It's a beautiful lie, a well-crafted, carefully maintained piece of public relations that I have built around myself like a fortress. But it is a lie, because the truth is, I am afraid of everything. I'm just more afraid of being silent. If you've ever had to build a new person out of the ashes of the one you used to be, you know what I'm talking about. You know what it's like to live with a ghost inside you. Hit that like button if you're a survivor. You are not alone. Tonight was the pinnacle of my carefully constructed new life. I was in the grand ballroom of a hotel in New York City, a place so opulent it felt like it was carved from solid gold. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and self-congratulation. It was the night of the annual DuPont Columbia Awards, the most prestigious honor in broadcast journalism, and I, Anya Sharma, the woman my family had once called a failure, was the guest of honor. My documentary, The Orchard of Weeds, had won the gold baton. It was a brutal, unflinching, 2-year investigation into a series of corrupt, for-profit elder care facilities, a story of greed and abuse that had led to federal indictments and systemic change. I was proud of the work. It was the most important thing I had ever done. But sitting there, in a borrowed designer gown, surrounded by the most powerful people in my industry, I felt like an imposter, a ghost in a fancy dress. My mentor and producer, a wonderful, grizzled old journalist named David, was sitting beside me, beaming with a paternal pride my own father had never once shown me. "Look at you, kid," he whispered. As the host began my introduction, "You're the queen of the damn world tonight." I tried to smile, but it felt like a mask. The host was reading from a teleprompter, his voice a smooth, professional baritone, a journalist of unflinching courage and profound empathy. Sharma's work has become a voice for the voiceless. The words washed over me, a language from a country I didn't feel like I belonged to. Courage, empathy, voice, to the world. That was who I was. But in the quiet, secret archives of my own memory, I was someone else entirely. I was a 16-year-old girl, huddled in the dark, my voice a silent scream that no one could hear. And now, to accept the gold baton for journalistic excellence, please welcome Anya Sharma. The ballroom erupted in applause. The lights found me. I stood up on shaky legs, the silk of my gown whispering around me. I made my way to the stage, the walk feeling like a mile. As I stepped into the bright, hot circle of the spotlight, a photographer at the foot of the stage raised his camera. The flash that followed was a sudden, violent explosion of white light, and in that split second, I was gone. The grand ballroom, the applause, the golden award, it all dissolved. The scent of perfume was replaced by the cloying, sweet smell of cheap cake frosting and my stepmother's hairspray. The elegant music was replaced by the thumping, teenage beat of a 90s pop song. I was no longer a 39-year-old woman in a designer gown. I was a 16-year-old girl in a faded, ill-fitting t-shirt. And I was standing in the hallway of the house that was supposed to be my home. My childhood was a masterclass in psychological warfare. My mother had died when I was 10, and a year later, my father had married Brenda. Brenda was a woman who was as beautiful as she was cruel. A woman whose love was a conditional, transactional thing. And her love was reserved exclusively for her own daughter, Ashley, who was exactly my age. Brenda and Ashley had entered my life like an occupying army. My quiet, bookish world was instantly colonized by their loud, pink, and relentlessly cheerful brand of tyranny, my father. A man who had always been a little weak, a little lost, had simply surrendered. He had wanted a happy, perfect, new family, and he was willing to sacrifice his own daughter's well-being on the altar of that desire. In their new family, I was the problem, the ghost of the old wife, the quiet, sullen, and ungrateful daughter who didn't fit into their new, bright world. They didn't see my grief. They saw it as a bad attitude. They didn't see my quiet nature. They saw it as a rebellion. I was the nail that stuck up, and Brenda and my father hammered me down. Again and again, my academic achievements were ignored. While Ashley's cheerleading trophies were displayed on the mantle, my friends were deemed weird. While Ashley's popular friends were always welcome, I was the failure, the difficult one, the ungrateful child who was lucky to have a roof over her head. My home had become enemy territory, and I was a prisoner of war. The flashback that had ambushed me on that stage was from a specific night, the night of Ashley's 16th birthday party. The house was full of her loud, popular friends. The music was vibrating through the floorboards, and I had been given my orders. I was not to be a guest, I was to be the help. I can still see my stepmother, Brenda, standing in the kitchen, a list in her hand. "Okay, Anya," she had said, not using my name. Just Anya, like an order. "You're on drinks and snacks. Keep the bowls full and the glasses filled. And for God's sake, try to look pleasant. No one wants to see your sour face at a party." I was the unpaid, unappreciated, in-house catering staff. I spent the next hour carrying trays of mini quiches and refilling plastic cups with cheap soda, navigating a sea of teenagers who looked right through me. I was a ghost in my own home, a servant to my own stepsister. The memory was so vivid, so real, that for a moment, on that stage in New York, I could feel the phantom weight of a tray of empty cups in my hands, an inspiration to us all. The host's voice broke through the fog, pulling me back to the present. He was holding the heavy, golden baton out to me. I took it. My hands were shaking. I turned to face the crowd, the sea of shadowy, expectant faces, and for a terrifying second, I had no idea who I was. Was I Anya, the award-winning journalist, or was I Anya, the girl who was about to be broken? I opened my mouth to speak, and the voice that came out was a stranger's. It was calm, it was steady. It was the voice of the woman I had built, piece by piece, out of the wreckage of that house. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you to the committee. I am deeply honored." I gave my speech. I thanked David. I thanked my team. I dedicated the award to the brave whistleblowers who had trusted me with their stories, and to the victims of the abuse we had uncovered. It was a good speech, a powerful speech. The audience was moved. They gave me a standing ovation. But as I stood there, bathed in their applause, my mind was a split screen. In one half, I was the successful, fearless woman they saw. In the other, I was still that 16-year-old girl, standing in that hallway, on the verge of the moment that would shatter my life and ultimately save it. After the speech, I returned to my table, the heavy award in my hand. It felt both like a shield and a burden. People came up to congratulate me, powerful, famous people, network executives, news anchors. They shook my hand. They told me my work was important. They called me brave. And with every compliment, the memory of that night grew stronger, more insistent. I remembered the heat in the crowded living room. I remembered the cloying sweetness of Ashley's perfume. I remembered the feeling of being utterly, completely alone. The praise I was receiving tonight was for the woman I had become. But that woman, the one they called fearless, had been forged in the fire of a profound and terrible fear. She had been born in the crucible of a single, defining act of rebellion. I sat through the rest of the ceremony in a daze. David, my mentor, must have sensed something was wrong. He put a comforting hand on my arm. "You okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked at him. My dear friend, the man who was more of a father to me than my own father had ever been. "I'm okay, David," I whispered. "Just a lot of ghosts in the room tonight." He nodded, his wise old eyes full of an understanding I didn't have to explain. When the ceremony was finally over, I escaped the ballroom as quickly as I could. I needed to be alone. I went back to my hotel room, the heavy golden baton in my hand. I stood in front of the mirror. I saw the woman in the designer gown, the successful journalist, the toast of the town, but I also saw the ghost of the girl she had been, her eyes wide with a fear that never truly goes away. The award I had won was for giving a voice to the voiceless, but the truth was, for the first 16 years of my life, I had been voiceless, too. The story of how I found my voice was not a story of triumph. It was a story of trauma, It was the story of the night my father and my stepmother had tried to silence me for good. It was the story of the night they broke my ribs, and in doing so, broke the chains that had kept me a prisoner in their house. And it was a story I was finally, after all these years, ready to tell. The golden statuette in my hand felt impossibly heavy, a solid, tangible anchor to a present I was no longer in. The applause from the ballroom was a distant, roaring ocean. The flash of the camera had been a rip in the fabric of time, and I had fallen through it, back into the suffocating, shag-carpeted hell of my 16th year. It was the night of Ashley's 16th birthday party, the social event of the season for the sophomore class of Northwood High. Our small suburban house had been transformed into a teenage nightclub. Balloons in obnoxious shades of pink and silver were taped to the walls. A strobe light, rented by Brenda for the occasion, pulsed erratically in the corner of the living room, making the dancing teenagers look like jerky, disconnected puppets. The music was so loud that the cheap knickknacks on the shelves were vibrating. And I was the maid. That wasn't a metaphor. It was my official, assigned role. The party was for Ashley and her 50 closest, most popular friends. My presence as a guest, as a sister, was not requested. My labor, however, was mandatory. Brenda had laid out my duties that morning with the crisp, cheerful efficiency of a prison warden. "Anya," she'd said, not looking up from her clipboard, "your father and I will be in the kitchen, managing the food. Your job is the floor. You will circulate. You will collect empty cups and plates. You will make sure the snack bowls are never empty. You will smile. You will be pleasant. You will be invisible. Do you understand?" I understood. My role in this family was to be a function, not a person. My purpose was to serve the needs and comforts of Brenda and her perfect daughter, Ashley. For the first 2 hours of the party, I did my job. I moved through the throngs of laughing, shouting teenagers like a ghost. I wore a faded t-shirt and old jeans, a stark contrast to the trendy, brand-name outfits of the guests. I was a gray smudge in their vibrant, colorful world. They looked right through me, or, if they did see me, it was only to thrust an empty cup in my direction without a word of thanks. I was part of the furniture, a mobile, human trash can. I could feel the familiar, hot shame coiling in my gut. But I did what I had always done. I swallowed it, I pushed it down, I compartmentalized. It was a survival skill I had learned early on in my life with Brenda and my father. To show pain was to show weakness, and weakness, in our house, was always punished. The humiliation reached its peak around 10 o'clock. I was in the kitchen, loading a tray with more plastic cups, when my father came in. "Hey," he said, avoiding my eyes as he opened the refrigerator to grab a beer. "You doing okay out there, kiddo?" "I'm fine, Dad. I lied." Good, he said, taking a long pull from the bottle. "It's a great party, isn't it? Brenda did a wonderful job. And Ashley, my God, she's so beautiful. She's the queen of the ball." He smiled a sad, wistful smile. I wish you would try harder. Anya, to fit in, to be more like her. Life would be so much easier for you if you did. It was the thesis statement of my entire childhood. Be more like Ashley, be less like you. He saw my quiet, introverted nature not as a personality trait, but as a deliberate act of defiance against the happy, popular family he was trying to build. He thought I could just choose to be different, to be the daughter he and Brenda wanted, and my refusal to do so was a constant, personal rejection of him. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my tray of cups and went back out to the floor, the war zone. And that's when it happened. The final straw. The moment that the quiet, compliant, and broken part of me finally died. Ashley was holding court in the center of the living room, surrounded by her adoring friends. She was laughing, telling some story, her face flushed with the triumph of being 16, and popular, and beautiful. She saw me approaching with the tray of cups. Her eyes lit up with a spark of casual, cruel inspiration. She stopped her story mid-sentence. "Oh, look, everyone," she announced, her voice dripping with a fake, theatrical sweetness. "It's the help my sad little sister, Anya. Isn't she the best? She's been working so hard all night to make my party perfect." Then she did something I will never forget. She snapped her fingers at me. A loud, sharp, commanding snap, like a person summoning a dog. "Anya," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm thirsty. And this whole area is a mess. Be a doll and get me a fresh soda. And then clean up all these empty cups. Would you? It's what you're here for." The circle of teenagers around her snickered, a wave of hot, white-hot rage. So pure and so intense it almost made me dizzy. Washed over me, it was a rage that had been simmering for 6 long years. A rage I had been swallowing down, day after day, and in that moment, it finally, boiled over. My hands were shaking. I looked at my stepsister, at her smug, smiling, pretty face, and I made a decision. It wasn't a loud, dramatic decision. It was a quiet one, but it was the most important decision of my life. I calmly walked over to the nearest table. I set down the tray of fresh cups, and then I looked Ashley directly in the eye, and I said the one word I had never been allowed to say in that house, the one word that was the ultimate act of rebellion. No, the word was quiet, but it landed in that noisy, crowded room like a bomb. The music was still thumping, but the conversation in our little corner of the room just stopped. Ashley's friends stared at me, their mouths open. Ashley's perfect, smiling face collapsed into a mask of pure, ugly disbelief. What did you just say?" "I said no," I repeated, my voice a little stronger now. "I'm not your maid, Ashley, and I'm done serving you." For a second, she just stared at me, completely speechless. I had broken the script. I had refused to play my part. And in front of her friends, I had shattered her illusion of absolute power. Her embarrassment was a visible, physical thing. Her face turned a deep, blotchy red. "Mom," she shrieked, her voice a childish wail. "Dad, Anya is ruining my party." She turned and ran toward the kitchen. The confrontation was just beginning. I stood my ground. A moment later, my stepmother, Brenda, stormed out of the kitchen, my father trailing in her wake like a nervous puppy. Brenda's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "What?" she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Is the meaning of this?" "I just said that I wasn't going to act as a servant for Ashley and her friends anymore," I said, my heart hammering in my chest, but my voice surprisingly steady. "You are embarrassing this family in front of our guests," she spat, her eyes darting around to see who was watching. "The only one embarrassing this family," I replied, a new, unfamiliar courage surging through me, "is you, by treating your husband's daughter like a slave." That was when my father finally spoke. "That's enough. Anya," he said, his voice a low growl, "you will apologize to your sister and your stepmother right now for what I asked," turning to face him, for finally having a shred of self-respect, for being a difficult, ungrateful, and selfish little girl, Brenda shrieked, her control finally snapping. "After everything we do for you, the roof over your head, the food you eat, this is how you repay us, by trying to ruin your sister's one special night. Her special night does not give her the right to treat me like dirt," I said. And then my father moved. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep like claws. "You are coming with me," he snarled, and he began to drag me toward the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the party guests. "Let go of me," I cried, trying to pull away. He was stronger. He dragged me into the dim, narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. Brenda followed right behind us, her face a mask of triumphant rage. "You have been a thorn in my side since the day I moved into this house," Brenda hissed, her face close to mine, a sad, sullen little reminder of a life your father was all too happy to leave behind. "You will learn your place." "My place is not as your servant," I said, my voice shaking, but I did not back down. "Your place," my father growled, his face red with a rage I knew all too well, "is wherever I tell you it is." He tightened his grip on my arm, and he shoved me, hard. My body flew backward. And the corner of the hallway console table, a heavy, ugly piece of oak, slammed into my side with a sickening, explosive force. A sharp, white-hot, electric pain shot through my ribs. The air left my lungs in a single, whooshing gasp. I collapsed to the floor, unable to breathe, the world dissolving into a black, sparkling tunnel of agony. I remember the sound, a low, wet, cracking sound, the sound of my own bones breaking. I looked up from the floor, gasping for air. My father and my stepmother were standing over me. My father's face was a mask of shock and a dawning, horrified regret. But Brenda's face, her face was cold and hard and utterly without remorse. "See what you made him do," she said, her voice a cruel, triumphant whisper. "You brought this on yourself." They turned and walked away, back to the party, leaving me crumpled on the floor in the hallway. A broken toy they had grown tired of. The thumping bass of the music from the living room was the soundtrack to the end of my childhood. I lay there for I don't know how long, every breath a fresh, new agony. The pain in my ribs was immense, but it was nothing compared to the pain in my heart, the pain of being betrayed, of being broken, by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect me. And in that moment, as I lay on the floor of my own personal hell, I made a vow I would get out, I would survive, and I would spend the rest of my life becoming someone so powerful, so fearless, that no one would ever be able to hurt me like that again. They had no idea who I was about to become. Pain is a great clarifier. As I lay there on the cold, hard floor of the hallway, every breath a fresh stab of agony in my side, the world came into a sharp, terrifying focus. The muffled, thumping bass of my stepsister's party was the soundtrack to my revelation. The house, with its laughter and its music and its cheap cake frosting, was not my home. It was a prison. And my father and my stepmother were not my family. They were my jailers. I knew, with a certainty that cut through the pain, that if I did not leave that night, I would never leave at all. If I stayed, if I let them find me in the morning, the narrative would be set. They would say I had fallen. They would say I was clumsy, or drunk, or looking for attention. They would take me to the doctor, and they would tell the story for me. They would break my bones, and then they would steal my truth. That was the one thing I had left, the one thing I would not let them take. I don't know how long I lay there. 10 minutes, an hour. Time had ceased to have any meaning, but eventually, the initial, blinding wave of pain subsided into a manageable, throbbing agony. I used the wall to pull myself up, a whimper escaping my lips as the broken ribs grated against each other. Every movement was a fresh hell, but I had a mission. I crept back to my room, a ghost in my own house. The party was still going strong. No one had come looking for me. No one had even noticed I was gone. I was, as Brenda had always wanted, completely invisible. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a cold, clear machine. I pulled a small backpack from the back of my closet. I packed only the essentials, a change of clothes, the toothbrush from my bathroom, the small stash of cash I had saved from a summer job, about $300 hidden in a book, and the book itself, my worn, dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. It was the only thing in that room that felt like it truly belonged to me. I looked around the room I had grown up in, the room my real mother had decorated. It was the last piece of her that was left in this house, and I knew I was leaving it, and her, behind forever. I scribbled a short, simple note on a piece of paper and left it on my pillow. It didn't say where I was going. It didn't say goodbye. It just said, in big, block letters, "You will not speak for me." Then, I opened my bedroom window. I dropped my backpack onto the soft grass of the flower bed below, and then, wincing with every agonizing movement, I climbed out, leaving the house of my childhood behind for the last time. I was 16 years old, with 3 broken ribs, $300, and a book, and I was, for the first time in my life, completely and utterly free. The first few days were a blur of pain and fear. I spent the first night huddled in the all-night waiting room of the bus station, my arms wrapped around my backpack, my whole body trembling from the pain and the cold. The world, which had been a small, suffocating prison, was now a vast, terrifying, and indifferent wilderness. I knew I needed a doctor, but I was terrified of going to a hospital. I was a minor. They would ask questions. They would call my father, and I knew, with a certainty that was deeper than my pain, that I could never, ever go back. So I endured. I wrapped my own torso with an ace bandage I bought at a 24-hour pharmacy. I lived on painkillers and coffee. The money, of course, ran out fast. I spent 2 nights sleeping on a park bench, learning the hard, fast lessons of being homeless, the art of being invisible, the constant, low-grade fear, the gnawing, soul-crushing hunger, the profound, absolute loneliness. It was the hardest and most important education of my life. My salvation, when it came, was a place I had always loved, the public library. It was warm, it was safe, it was free, and it was full of stories. A quiet promise that other worlds, other lives, were possible. On my 3rd day of homelessness, I walked into the city's main library, and I didn't leave until they kicked me out at closing time. The librarian at the front desk, a kind, older woman with wise eyes, must have seen the desperation on my face. She didn't ask any questions. She just pointed me toward a bulletin board in the back. On it was a small, faded flyer for a place called The Haven, a shelter for at-risk and homeless youth. That night, for the first time in my life, I asked for help. The Haven was not a palace. It was a crowded, noisy, and often chaotic place. But it was safe. It gave me a clean bed, a hot meal, and a door that locked. It was run by a group of tired, overworked, and deeply compassionate social workers who didn't ask for my story, but just created a space where I could start to write a new one. I spent the next 2 years of my life in a state of fierce, determined survival. I finished my high school credits and got my GED, studying for hours every day in my beloved library. I got a job. Then 2. I was a waitress at a Greasy Spoon diner during the day, and I cleaned office buildings at night. I saved every single dollar I could, my money stuffed into an envelope under my mattress at the shelter. My life was a grueling, exhausting, and relentless grind, and I had never been happier because it was mine. Every single, hard-won piece of it was mine. The turning point, the moment that my life pivoted from mere survival to something more, happened, as these things so often do, by chance. It happened at the diner. His name was David Chen. He was an old-school journalist, the kind who seemed to be a dying breed even then. He was in his 60s, with a face like a crumpled road map, a cynical attitude, and the kindest, most intelligent eyes I had ever seen. He was a regular at the diner, an eccentric who would sit in the same booth for hours, drinking black coffee, scribbling in a reporter's notebook, and arguing with the editors at the small, independent newspaper he worked for over his bulky cell phone. He had started talking to me, at first just the usual diner banter, but he was different from the other customers. He saw me. He would ask me what book I was reading on my break. He noticed the ink stains on my fingers. He saw the fierce, hungry intelligence I tried so hard to hide. One slow Tuesday afternoon, he was the only customer in the place. He looked up from his notebook as I refilled his coffee. "You know, Anya," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I've been watching you for months. You're the hardest working person in this place, but your mind is 1,000 miles away. You're not a waitress. So what's your story?" I don't know why, but I told him not the whole story, not the part about the ribs or the cruelty, or the real, raw, bloody truth of it. I gave him the sanitized version, that I had a difficult family life, that I had left home at 16 to make my own way, that I was trying to save money for college. He listened, his gaze never leaving my face. When I was done, he just nodded slowly. I figured it was something like that. He said, "You've got the eyes of a survivor." He took a sip of his coffee. "You're smart, you're angry, and you know how to be invisible. Those are the 3 qualities that make a great investigative journalist." I just stared at him. "I run a small independent paper," he continued. "We don't have a lot of money, but we do good work. We tell the stories that the big, corporate papers won't touch. We fight for the little guy. I need an intern, a researcher, someone to do the grunt work, the digging, the fact-checking. It pays next to nothing, the hours are terrible, and it is the most important work in the world. Are you interested?" It was a life raft, a ladder out of the hole I had been in. It was a chance. I started the next day. And from the moment I walked into the loud, chaotic, and beautiful mess of that newsroom. I knew I was home. David became my mentor, my teacher, and the father I had never had. He taught me how to write. He taught me how to dig. He taught me how to find the story, the real story, buried beneath the lies. And I discovered something about myself. The same obsessive, analytical mind my grandfather had seen in me. The part of me that my family had dismissed as weird was a superpower in this world. I was good at this. I was good at seeing the patterns, at finding the inconsistencies, at following the money. But most importantly, David taught me how to channel my own rage, the deep, burning, and righteous anger I felt about the injustice of my own past. He taught me how to turn it into a weapon for the truth, a weapon for other people who, like me, had been silenced, who had been hurt, who had been told they were nothing. My first real byline story was an exposé on an abusive landlord in a low-income housing project. I had spent weeks interviewing the tenants, digging through public records, and building a case, piece by piece. The day it was published on the front page of the paper, I stood on a street corner and I watched people reading my words, and I felt a sense of purpose so profound. It was like a religious conversion. I was not a victim anymore. I was a voice. That was the beginning. I worked my way through community college, then a 4-year journalism program. All while working for David, I learned, I grew, and I found my calling. My calling wasn't just to report the news. It was to hold the powerful accountable. It was to tell the stories of the voiceless. I had taken the ugliest, most painful parts of my own story, the helplessness, the invisibility, the silence, and I had forged them into a shield and a sword. They had no idea who I had become. I had become the person they had always been terrified of, a woman who knew the truth and was not afraid to tell it. The weeks after the awards ceremony were a whirlwind. My documentary, The Orchard of Weeds, had a second life. It was picked up by a major streaming service. The story of the elder care abuse I had uncovered became a national conversation. My production company was flooded with offers, with tips, with the desperate pleas of other people who had stories that needed to be told. My life, which had been a quiet, solitary pursuit of the truth, was suddenly very, very loud. I tried to stay grounded. I tried to remember the lessons David had taught me, that the story is never about you. It's about the truth. But for the first time, the fortress I had built around myself, the one named Anya Sharma, the fearless journalist, felt real. The ghost of the broken girl in the hallway was still there, but her whispers were fainter now, drowned out by the noise of my new life. I was in the middle of vetting a new project, an investigation into a corrupt water reclamation district in California, when David walked into my office and dropped a thin file on my desk. "Scrap the water district," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I've got your next one." David was officially retired, but he still kept an ear to the ground. He had a network of old sources and informants that was legendary. When David said he had a story, you listened. "What is it?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "It's a local story," he said, "right here in our own backyard. A charity. The Northwood Youth Alliance. You know it." I nodded. Everyone knew the Northwood Youth Alliance. It was a beloved local institution, a non-profit dedicated to helping at-risk teens. They had a community center, after-school programs, job training. Their founder and director was a man who was practically a local saint, a pillar of the community, a man named Richard Peterson. "What about it?" I asked. "I got a call from an old source," David said, his eyes narrowing. "A woman who used to be the bookkeeper there. She quit a month ago. She says the place is a front, a piggy bank for Peterson and his board of directors. She says they're skimming millions from donations and federal grants, and that the kids are getting the scraps." I felt a familiar, cold thrill. It was the feeling I got at the start of every investigation, the scent of a lie, the promise of a hidden truth. "Does she have proof?" I asked. David slid a few documents out of the file. "She has this," he said. They were copies of internal invoices. On the surface, they looked normal, but to a trained eye, they were full of red flags. A construction company with no local address being paid $500,000 for renovations. A food supplier, a company I'd never heard of, billing for tens of thousands of dollars a month, an amount that was wildly disproportionate to the number of kids in their programs. It's a starting point, I said, my mind already working. It's thin, but it's a thread. Let me see what I can pull. And so, my next investigation began. I assigned 2 of my best young researchers to start the preliminary digital dig public records, tax filings, incorporation documents, the boring, tedious, and absolutely essential groundwork of any investigation. For the next 2 weeks, we worked, and with every document we uncovered, the thread my source had given us began to weave itself into a rope. The Northwood Youth Alliance, on paper, was a model charity. Their 990 tax forms were immaculate. Their board of directors was a who's who of local business leaders. But when we started digging into the vendors they were using, the story began to change. The construction company that had been paid for the renovations was a shell corporation, registered to an address in Delaware that was nothing but a mail drop. The food supplier was owned by the brother-in-law of the Youth Alliance's treasurer. We found a pattern of no-bid contracts, of inflated invoices, of money being funneled to companies that were all connected, in one way or another. To the board of directors, it was a classic. Self-dealing fraud scheme, a closed loop of corruption. And at the center of the web, the spider himself, was the charity's founder and director, Richard Peterson. He was the one signing off on all the payments. His signature was on every fraudulent invoice. The more I learned about Richard Peterson, the more my stomach turned. He was a master of public relations. His picture was always in the local paper, accepting a giant check from some corporate sponsor, his arm around a smiling, grateful-looking teenager. He gave speeches at Rotary clubs. He was lauded as a community hero, a man who had dedicated his life to helping the less fortunate. The whole thing was a lie, a beautifully crafted, carefully maintained lie. The story was solid, it was important, but there was a piece missing, a personal connection, to make a documentary that would truly resonate. I needed more than just financial records. I needed to understand the man himself. I started digging into the history of Richard Peterson. And this is the part, you guys, where my world, my carefully constructed, safe, new world, was about to collide with the haunted, broken world I had run away from 23 years ago. I was deep into a late-night search, scrolling through old digitized newspaper articles about the founding of the Northwood Youth Alliance almost 20 years ago. And then I found it. An article from the local paper, dated 2005. The headline read, "Local Businessman Launches New Hope for City's Youth." And there was a picture. A grainy, black and white photograph of a group of people at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. In the center was a younger-looking man with a beaming smile, holding a pair of oversized scissors. The caption identified him as Richard Peterson, standing next to him. Her hand tucked into his arm was a beautiful, smiling woman. And next to her, a smiling, blonde, 16-year-old girl. My breath caught in my throat. I knew those faces. I knew them better than I knew my own. The woman was my stepmother, Brenda, and the girl was my stepsister, Ashley. It was impossible. A coincidence, a trick of the light. The name was wrong. My father's name was not Richard Peterson. My father's name was Richard Torres. My hands were shaking. I started a new search. A frantic, desperate dig into the public records of the man in the photograph. I searched for property records, for marriage licenses, for business filings. And I found it. A legal document, filed 22 years ago, a year after I had run away. A petition for a change of name. From Richard Manuel Torres to Richard Peterson. Peterson had been his mother's maiden name. He had legally erased his old identity, his old name, and created a new one. He had, in effect, erased me. He had reinvented himself. He had moved to a new city, taken a new name, and started a new life as a respectable philanthropist. He had taken the small inheritance he had gotten from his own parents, money that should have been part of my mother's legacy, and he had used it to start his charity, a charity he was now using as his own personal piggy bank. I stared at the screen, at the grainy photograph of the man who was both a stranger and the most terrifyingly familiar person in the world. The monster from my past was the monster in my present, my father, the man who had beaten me, the man who had broken me. was the subject of the biggest, most important investigation of my career. The room started to spin. I felt the air leave my lungs, the same feeling I had had on the hallway floor all those years ago. The carefully constructed fortress of Anya Sharma, the fearless journalist, was crumbling. The ghost of the 16-year-old girl was back, and she was screaming. I pushed my chair back from my desk and stumbled to the small bathroom in my office. I leaned over the sink, my knuckles white, and I was sick. I retched until there was nothing left, my body convulsing with the sheer, toxic horror of the revelation. He had a new life, a new name, a new reputation as a saint, and it was all built on a foundation of lies, the same lies he had used to control and abuse me, the same lies he was now using to steal from the most vulnerable children in the city. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were wide with a new, terrible clarity. For a moment, I saw the scared, broken girl I used to be. But then, she was gone, and in her place was the woman she had become, the woman who had clawed her way out of the darkness, the woman who had dedicated her life to telling the truth. This was not a coincidence. This was not a cruel trick of fate. This was a reckoning, a full-circle moment of such profound, terrible, and beautiful symmetry that it had to be more than just chance. The universe had just handed me the biggest, most dangerous, and most deeply personal story of my life. For 23 years, he had been a ghost who haunted my nightmares. Now, it was my turn to haunt him. I walked back to my desk, my steps steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard, and righteous fury. I looked at the picture of him on my screen, at his smiling, benevolent, lying face. He had no idea who I had become. He had no idea that the daughter he had beaten, and broken, and erased was now a journalist with a golden baton in her hand and the full, righteous power of the truth on her side. He thought he was going to be interviewed by a stranger. He had no idea he was about to face a ghost from his past, and this time, the ghost was the one with all the power. In the world of investigative journalism, the interview is the final battlefield. It's the moment you take all the evidence you have painstakingly gathered, the documents, the financial records, the secret sources, and you present it to your subject. It's a carefully orchestrated piece of theater, designed to strip away the lies, to break through the facade, and to capture a single, undeniable moment of truth on camera. I had conducted dozens of these interviews. I had sat across from corrupt politicians, from arrogant CEOs, from hardened criminals. I knew how to be calm, how to be relentless, how to control the room. But I had never prepared for an interview like this one. My request for an on-camera interview with Mr. Richard Peterson and his wife, Brenda, was, of course, immediately and enthusiastically accepted. My letter to them was a work of art, a masterpiece of professional flattery. I wrote about their tireless dedication to the community, their visionary leadership of the Northwood Youth Alliance, and my desire to feature them as the centerpiece of my next documentary. A film about local heroes making a difference. It was the perfect bait, and they took it hook, line, and sinker. Their narcissism, their desperate need for public adoration, was the very weakness I was now exploiting. They had no idea that the award-winning journalist, Anya Sharma, who was coming to interview them, was the same person as Anya Torres, the daughter they had beaten and discarded 23 years ago. I had taken my mother's maiden name when I turned 18, a legal and symbolic act of severing myself from their legacy. They had changed their own name to erase their past. We were two sides of the same coin, running from the same truth in opposite directions. The day of the interview, my team and I arrived at their house an hour early to set up. Walking up the driveway of that house, the house I had fled from in the middle of the night with 3 broken ribs and a shattered soul, was the hardest thing I have ever done. The exterior was different. They had added a new wing, a fancy 3-car garage, but the bones of the place were the same. It was a beautiful, stately colonial, a perfect picture of upper-middle-class success, a perfect lie. My mentor, David, had insisted on coming with me. He wasn't part of my usual camera crew, but he knew this story was different. He knew the ghost I was about to face. "You're in command here, kid," he'd said in the car on the way over, his hand on my shoulder. "Remember that. You're not that 16-year-old girl anymore. You're the one with the camera. You're the one with the truth." My father and Brenda greeted us at the door. They were the perfect hosts. Beaming with a practiced, political charm, they looked older, softer, but their eyes were the same, my father's, full of a weak, eager to please warmth, and Brenda's, my stepmother, sharp, cold, and constantly calculating. They looked right at me, shook my hand, and had absolutely no idea who I was. To them, I was just Anya Sharma, the important journalist who had come to validate their perfect lives. The feeling of being so close to them, yet so completely invisible, was a strange, cold, and powerful thrill. We set up in their formal living room, the same room where Ashley's 16th birthday party had taken place. My 2 cameramen set up the lights, the tripods, the sound equipment. It was a full, professional setup. We transformed their cozy, self-satisfied living room into a stark, unforgiving television studio. I was deliberately changing the environment, shifting the power dynamic before we even began. I had them sit together on their expensive cream-colored sofa. I sat opposite them in a simple, straight-backed chair. The cameras were positioned over my shoulder, focused on them. This was not a conversation. This was an interrogation. I started with the soft questions, the bait. I asked them about the founding of the Northwood Youth Alliance. I asked them about their passion for helping children. They were brilliant performers. They spoke in warm, moving platitudes about community, about giving back, about their profound sense of civic duty. My father even managed to produce a single, perfect tear as he spoke of the troubled kids he was trying to save. It was a beautiful and utterly fraudulent performance. I let them talk for 20 minutes. I let them build their own pedestal, brick by brick, lie by lie. I let them feel comfortable, confident, and completely in control. And then I made my move. I leaned forward slightly, my expression still one of polite, journalistic inquiry. It's a truly inspiring story. "Mr. Peterson," I said. "But I'd like to pivot for a moment, if you don't mind. Let's talk about the finances. Specifically, I'd like to ask you about a construction company your charity has worked with extensively. A company called Apex Construction." I saw a flicker of something in my father's eyes. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening. "I'm not sure I recall," he began. "Let me refresh your memory," I said, my voice still perfectly calm. I picked up a file from the floor beside my chair. "According to your own financial records, the Northwood Youth Alliance paid Apex Construction over $500,000 last year for renovations to your community center. Can you tell me about that work?" "It was a standard renovation," he stammered, looking to Brenda for help. "And can you tell me why?" I continued, not letting him off the hook. "The address listed for Apex Construction is a P.O. box in Delaware, and the company itself was incorporated just 2 days before you awarded them that no-bid contract." The color began to drain from my father's face. Brenda's perfect smile had become a thin, hard line. "I'm not sure I see what you're getting at," she said, her voice like ice. "What I'm getting at, Mrs. Peterson," I said, my gaze unwavering, "is that Apex Construction is a shell corporation, and according to my sources, the beneficial owner of that corporation is your brother. Is that correct?" Brenda's face went white. The trap was sprung. For the next 10 minutes, I calmly, methodically, and relentlessly dismantled their entire world. Live? On camera? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just asked questions. And with each question, I presented another piece of irrefutable, documentary evidence. "Can you explain this invoice from a food supplier that billed the charity for $50,000 worth of organic produce, when the former bookkeeper states that the children were primarily served frozen pizza? Can you explain these wire transfers from the Alliance's accounts to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands? Can you explain why you, Mr. Peterson, used the charity's funds to purchase a luxury vehicle that is registered in your name?" They tried to deny it. They tried to bluster. They tried to threaten. "This interview is over," my father snarled at one point. "If you end this interview now, Mr. Peterson," I replied, calmly, "my story will simply state that you refuse to answer questions regarding the allegations of fraud and embezzlement. that have been leveled against your organization, your choice. He sank back into the sofa, defeated. They were trapped. Their lies were useless against the cold. Hard facts I had laid out before them. Their polished, respectable world had been reduced to a pile of incriminating documents. Finally, they were broken. My father was just sitting there, a stunned, terrified look on his face. Brenda was on the verge of tears. And that was when I decided to deliver the final, killing blow. I leaned forward one last time. My professional mask, the one I had worn for the entire interview, finally fell away. I let them see the 16-year-old girl in my eyes. "You're right to be confused," I said, my voice a quiet, personal whisper that was still perfectly audible on the high-tech microphones. "You're probably wondering who I am, how I know all of this. You're wondering why I'm doing this to you." They just stared at me, their faces a mixture of terror and utter, profound confusion. "We have met before," I continued. "It was a long time ago. It was in this very house. In the hallway. Right over there." I pointed. There was a party. A 16th birthday party. I watched the memory dawn in their eyes. I watched the confusion give way to a new, more terrible, and absolutely impossible recognition. Brenda's hand flew to her mouth, a horrified gasp escaping her lips. My father looked as if he had just been shot. "You probably don't remember me," I said, my voice steady, but my heart was pounding like a drum. "My name is Anya Torres. And the last time we saw each other, in that hallway, you broke my ribs because I refused to serve a drink to my stepsister." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It was the sound of a past they thought they had buried, a ghost they thought they had exorcised, rising up to destroy them. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every flicker of guilt, of horror, of pure, unadulterated terror on their faces. I stood up. The interview was over. "Thank you for your time, Mr. and Mrs. Wart Peterson," I said, the professional back in my voice. "I believe I have everything I need." The silence in that living room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It was a silence made of pure, unadulterated shock. My father and my stepmother, Brenda, just sat there on their expensive cream-colored sofa, their faces ashen, their eyes wide with the horror of seeing a ghost. The ghost of the daughter they thought they had broken and erased. My camera crew, to their absolute professional credit, kept rolling. They didn't know the full story, but they knew a story when they saw one. They were capturing a moment of raw, terrible, and undeniable truth. My father's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The confident, charming philanthropist, the man who had just spent 20 minutes spinning a beautiful web of lies for my camera, had vanished. In his place was a small, scared, and guilty old man. Brenda was the first to find her voice. It wasn't the sharp, icy tone of the cruel stepmother. It was a thin, reedy, pathetic whisper. "Anya," she said, my old name sounding like a foreign word on her tongue. It can't be you." "I believe the birth certificate would disagree," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as a surgeon's hand. I looked at David, my mentor, who was standing by the camera, his face a mask of grim, profound understanding. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The interview was over. "That's a wrap," I said to my crew, my voice ringing out in the terrible silence. "Pack it up. We have what we need." My father finally seemed to snap out of his stupor. A dark, ugly flush was creeping up his neck. "You can't," he stammered, his voice a hoarse croak. "You can't use this. This is a family matter." I turned to look at him one last time. I let my gaze rest on him, the man who was my father, my abuser, and now, just the subject of my latest investigation. "You forfeited your right to call this a family matter 23 years ago, in the hallway of this very house," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. "This is a matter of public interest now. You built your life on the backs of vulnerable people. You used their suffering to fund this beautiful house and this beautiful life. And I am a journalist, and I am going to tell their story." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned my back on them, on the wreckage of their lives, on the ghosts of my own past, and I walked out of that house for the second and final time in my life. I didn't run. I didn't flee in the dead of night. I walked out in broad daylight, the head of my own crew, the master of my own story. The weeks leading up to the broadcast of The Orchard of Weeds were a flurry of activity. As expected, my father hired a team of expensive, aggressive lawyers. They sent threatening letters. They tried to get an injunction to stop the broadcast, claiming libel, claiming I had obtained information illegally, claiming I had a personal vendetta. They were flies, buzzing against a thick plate of glass. My production company's legal team, backed by David's decades of experience and my own meticulously documented evidence, was an impenetrable fortress. Every claim they made was met with a calm, professional, and fact-based rebuttal. My investigation had been flawless. The evidence was irrefutable. They had no case. Their threats were the last, pathetic roars of a dying empire. My family tried to reach me through other channels. My brother, who I hadn't seen in years, left a series of pleading voicemails. My aunts and uncles, my father's siblings, called, begging me to think of the family's reputation. And then, a week before the broadcast, a letter arrived at my office. It was from Ashley, my stepsister. Her handwriting was a perfect, looping script, just as it had been on the birthday party invitations all those years ago. I almost threw it away, but some morbid curiosity made me open it. Anya, it began. I don't know if you'll even read this. I don't blame you if you don't. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I'm asking you anyway. Please don't do this. Don't air the film. Not for their sake, but for mine, my mother and your father. They are not good people. I am starting to see that now, but they are all I have. This will destroy them. It will destroy everything. I know what they did to you was wrong. I was a child. I was selfish. I didn't understand, but please, don't ruin our lives. I read the letter, and I felt a brief, faint flicker of the old pity I used to feel for her. She had been a child, too, a product of her mother's toxic world. But she had also been a willing participant, and her letter, for all its pleading, was still seeped in the same selfishness that had defined her entire life. Don't ruin our lives. She didn't mention the lives my father and her mother had already ruined, the lives of the elderly people they had scammed, the lives of the at-risk children whose charity funds they had embezzled, and the life of the 16-year-old girl they had broken and left on the floor. I folded the letter and put it in the shredder. My mercy, my sympathy, was a resource I was now reserving for the truly deserving. The night the documentary aired, I didn't have a big party. I just sat in David's quiet living room, with a glass of whiskey in my hand. We watched it together, in silence. It was the best work I had ever done. The story was tight. The evidence was clear. The testimony from the other victims was heartbreaking and powerful. And the interview with my father and Brenda, it was a masterclass in journalistic deconstruction. I had edited it carefully. I had not included my final, personal reveal. The world did not need to know that the monster on the screen was my father. They just needed to know he was a monster. The final shot of the film was a long, slow zoom into his face. At the exact moment he realized he had been caught, his mask of benevolent charity crumbling into the raw, ugly face of a common thief. The public and legal fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The district attorney's office launched a criminal investigation the very next day, using my documentary as their roadmap. My father and Brenda were arrested. Their assets were frozen. Their names, which had been synonymous with philanthropy in our city, became synonymous with disgrace. The Northwood Youth Alliance was taken over by a court-appointed receiver, and its books were finally, truly, opened. Their friends abandoned them. Their business associates disowned them. The beautiful, perfect world they had built on a foundation of lies and abuse was utterly and completely destroyed. They lost everything. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt a quiet, somber, and profound sense of justice. My father and my stepmother were not punished because of my personal revenge. They were punished by the truth. I had simply been the one with the courage to turn on the light. My own story, the one about the broken ribs and the girl in the hallway, I kept for myself. It was mine. It was the source code of my strength, the fuel for my fire, but my public work was never about me. It was about them, the other victims, the other voiceless ones, A few months later, I was in my office, vetting my next story. It was a tip about an exploitative migrant labor camp in the agricultural fields of Central California. It was a big, dangerous, and important story, and I was ready to tell it. David poked his head into my office. "You sure you're ready for another one, kid?" he asked, his eyes full of a familiar, fatherly concern. "You've been through a lot." I looked up from the files, and I smiled, a real, genuine, and peaceful smile. The ghost in the hallway was finally quiet. The fortress of Anya Sharma and the girl she used to be had finally merged into one. I was no longer a survivor. I was just me. I was born ready. "David," I said, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. They had tried to break me, to silence me, to erase me, but they had failed, because you can't erase the truth. All you can do, if you're very, very brave, is tell it. And that had become my life's work, my calling, my victory.